Hi guys, I hope everyone is doing well and welcome to this third part of the pre-competition readiness workshop. So workshop number 6. So this one is just kind of going over some of the points from the first workshop within this context that I did. Also just to touch on some points that came up from last week with the little interview with Anna Hopkin. Hopefully everyone enjoyed that one. And this is kind of rounding those things up and starting to look a little bit on a more of a surface level rather than too in depth. Obviously, if there's any more depth that anyone wants to go into, you're more than welcome to ask for that off the back of this. But we're looking more at a surface level of, how do we start looking at applying some of these ideas into our training environment? How do we, really kind of get our teeth into proper evaluation of what we do in our processes and why that's also very important, and how we then kind of look at that from a race day perspective as well. So moving forward, so there we go, into this. So this is just kind of like the basic things we've been kind of covering over the last three workshops. So going again, the first one we looked at your basic pre-competition mental and emotional readiness. Last week we took a little bit of a deeper dive into looking at mental preparation, and it was really good of Anna to kind of drop by and talk a little bit about that for herself as well. Hopefully that kind of gave some even more personalized context to what that's like for someone on their particular journey, especially who's working at that level. And today we're just going to look at a little bit how we kind of plan and how we practice race day routines within our training environment and how we go about looking at evaluating that and assessing it. So, mentioned this in week one of this little process, that two real important starting points here, and this is not just from a mental readiness or pre-competition readiness point of view. This is for me as a coach. This is how you got to look at planning for anything. Planning for a training cycle, planning for setting up some work, planning for teachers, planning for a school term in terms of what they're going to do. They need to understand what the goals of that are and what the purpose is at the end of it all. What are you actually trying to strive towards? Understanding that and having a clear vision of it, that needs to be the first port of call before you really start going to anything. And then the second point is having a process to follow. And I think there's a key message here that it's a process, a singular process. Now, there are multiple different ways you can do anything, but I think at any one time, focusing on a way rather than on all of the ways is massively important. You don't want to drag yourself down into loads of complicated ideas where you've got multiple different things coming from left, right, and center. You want to give yourself a thing to do, and then you want to evaluate that, tweak it, take it to a point where you feel like this is actually work for me and I can stick with this, or it's maybe not quite for me, and then you move forward into a different idea. I think you need to understand that tweaking process that takes place with any idea or any process in anything that we do. So having that to follow and understanding how to evaluate that properly is important. So moving forward, so just going back to week one, the kind of some of the key areas that we looked at in terms of preparing mentally and emotionally were getting into the zone, what that looks like for you, how do you approach that, and what are the methods that you use, looking at some relaxation techniques, a lot of it about breathing and how we utilize those before we compete or even before we train, and we'll talk about that briefly in a second. How we use imagery, how we use music, big message there with the music side, making sure that it's personal to you and it's not just a song that you randomly pick out of the sky. It is a personal thing and something that you can really connect to. And then moving forward is to how we practice those. And this is kind of where we're going with this today. So make sure that window's out of the way. A little bit in the way of the words there. That'll do. It'll be fine. So putting pre-competition strategies into your practice. Okay, there are three little components here that I want to kind of go into a little bit of discussion about. The first one is learning how to apply continuous development. So I'm going to bring back the evaluation idea a little bit here, just to kind of really hammer it home that you need to have a process for that, and you need to understand why it's valuable and what it does for you. How you then apply these strategies into training, which I think is a big part of this whole process and something I feel like historically has not been done as well as it could have been, and something that I feel like it's almost like an easy win for a lot of athletes, that if you implement layers of your preparation and what you're focusing on top of the training sessions that you do, the content of that I deliver or Mike delivers or whatever. And then you can start layering your own personal preparation methods on top of that. Then you start getting a really big multi-dimensional training session that will benefit you in many ways without you even realizing it. And then we're just going to look a little bit about race day as well there. So moving forward, so just going back into, let's go make this window a little smaller if I can. No, this is awful. There we go. That'll do. Flick that back. Boop, boop, boop. Right, so looking at a cycle for continuous development or an evaluation process. Now, I brought this up in week 1, and this is something called the 4 E's, and this is just a bit of a reminder of what I talked about a couple of weeks ago. The 4 E's of this process of kind of almost giving yourself an opportunity to always move forward from things that have happened or things that you've done. So part 1 of this is envisioning what you want, what you want to do. That's setting goals. It's planning. It's laying out the schematic, I guess, for where you want to go and what you want to do. Part 2 is enacting. So actually going and doing it. I think it's important to put a plan in place, go and do it. Now, you may have little things that you may need to adjust here and there, but it's important to go and actually give it a go in the best way possible that you planned it, which then leads into part 3, where you then evaluate what you've just gone and done. Now, we can bring this down to a really small level here. We can look at this as a training set, okay? Like a singular training set. So the envision part from a coaching perspective is, we've envisioned a set. This is the purpose of it. This is what we're trying to achieve. It might be a technical set. It might be a physiological set. It could be anything. We've envisioned a set. Now we go and do it. Hopefully with not too many tweaks for various different things. There's always outside things that you have to consider, but hopefully with not too much change. And then what you can do after that is go back and evaluate it. So how did it go? Did it have the effect that you were wanting it to have? And as an athlete, after you've envisioning a set for an athlete could be looking and go, well, okay, so what is it that I want to get from this particular set today that will carry me forward to get that ultimate goal that I've set for myself? Again, enacting it, going and actually completing it to the best of your ability, giving it everything that you possibly can to make sure that and understand how it has affected you and what's actually come from it. Evaluating it. Was I able to maximize my potential within that particular set? Was I going the right stroke rate, the right stroke counts? Was I executing my turns well? The evaluation part then starts throwing up questions of things that you've done well, things that you really need to move forward and work on next time that this comes up. And then what you can do on part 4 there with the enhancing side is you then go into the next set with the knowledge from the evaluation, the enacting and the envisioning part of it, to go into and start that cycle again by going and doing that cycle better, or that set better, because you've gone in with this enhanced understanding of, well, next time I need to make sure my drive off the block, for example, is better. I need to make sure I execute that well. You've enhanced that by understanding what needs to be done moving forward, and then that whole cycle starts again. So hopefully that makes some sense, and you can understand how you could potentially put that into a context for anything, really. It's not just swimming. It could be training, it could be coaching, it could be schoolwork, it could be anything, really. So I think as an extra kind of side note to all of this, when it comes to looking at continuous development and evaluating things, that outcomes are often not effective markers when it comes to evaluating your own processes. So some of the simplest examples I'll be able to come to in a second, but I think focusing on outcomes as being the judging factor as to whether something has gone well can often be a bit misleading. There are a lot of things that can influence that. So why are outcomes often not the most effective markers? So three simple points there, I guess. There's probably a lot more, but these are just 3 that I identified. The first one being, most often a lot of outcomes results are out of your control. If we look at swimming, if you want to win a medal, for example, you cannot control the rest of that field. You can only control your own performance. And if you go deeper in that, if it doesn't quite come off, you got to kind of look deep at what you could have controlled, but maybe chose not to, or not to dive deep enough into. There are a lot of things within that example of winning a medal, there are things that you can't control within that situation. So winning a medal can be a little bit flimsy in terms of deciding whether what you've done in training or the processes you've put in place have actually been effective. You may not have achieved the goal that you wanted, but that doesn't mean that the processes and the plan that you had in place, for example, hasn't done the right things. So the second point, outcomes can be too rooted in emotions and bias. Emotions is something we'll go into a little bit more as well. And bias means basically things that you do naturally that you don't really think too much about. So you may have a bias towards this is a funny one, Pepsi rather than Coke. You maybe can't explain why you prefer one or the other, but you just have a natural bias towards that one thing, and you will support that one thing and maybe not give too much consideration about why someone would like the other thing, or maybe even why you might like the other thing if you tried it, for example. Maybe that's not a good example, I don't know. That's the best one I could think of on the spot. And rooted in emotions, a lot of goals that we set for ourselves tend to be very much from the heart. It's things that we desire, and with that desire comes a lot of emotion, and it can be very difficult, again, to judge the process that you've gone through, whether it's the training plan, whether it's the mental preparation, the warm-up you've done, whatever it is. It can be very difficult to judge that properly if emotion gets too caught up in that evaluation, and that's something we'll come to briefly. And also as well with outcomes, it can very much ignore the steps that you've taken to get to that readiness to go and get that final goal or outcome. And an easy example here is you could train as hard as possible, give it everything you've got. You could have the best skills that you could possibly do at that moment in time. You could have done every session, done everything that you needed to do, everything that's been put towards you, you've done all this extra stuff, but you can go into a race and for some reason it just doesn't go your way. And that could be uncontrollable things, but it could just be one of those days where it's just not happening. And we've all experienced them, and they do happen. Sometimes you can't explain everything that happens to you when you go into a competition, and the problem with using outcomes in those situations is that you could have done all of those steps perfect, absolutely nailed it every time and did it to the best of your ability. But then what can happen is you can judge the entire situation and the entire process on that one result that didn't quite go the way you wanted to for a multitude of reasons. And then all of that other stuff gets ignored and wiped off the plate, which is obviously something that's not the best way of going about an evaluation or how you look at how you move things forward. So there's some examples here, so using times as an evaluation tool is not a good way of dealing with things. Again, there are a lot of things you can control about your performance, but you can't control the clock. It's simple. And, time is, again, it's an emotional thing that you set for yourself. And a lot of times can end up being quite arbitrary, things that you just decide you want to do. There's not a huge amount of evidence base behind it. Therefore, it's very, very dangerous to be setting times up as being this thing that you judge everything by. Because like I said about the stepping stones that you take, you could do all of these things and maybe not hit that exact time. And that's not a failure. You've still moved forward. You've still got better at things. You just haven't quite put the icing on the cake. Medals won. We've already talked about, things out of your control. You can't control medals. You can't. In any given final, there are 7, depends on what pool you're in, but there are 7 other people who are going against you. And in a final, what your PB is irrelevant. It's about getting in there and racing, and there are people who can pull things out when they race, but you can't control that. You can only control your effort and what you do. Numbers of PBs, very much irrelevant. You can't judge the processes you've gone through, and using mental preparation as an example. If you go through a mental preparation process and you've got really, really set, and you go and do a competition and you come out with one PB when you're expecting 12, and then go, oh, well, that mental preparation process doesn't work. Well, that's not a very good way of measuring it, because what's the evidence behind it not working? Just because the meet wasn't exactly the way that you desired it to be doesn't mean that the process doesn't work for you. And this is why you've got to, we'll talk a little bit more about emotions coming into play. You got to take a lot of those external, uncontrollable things out of it and focus on what is the right thing for me, what is going to get the best out of me. Not kind of jumping to a conclusion because it hasn't worked on that given day or in that given race. And obviously, competitors you beat. I mean, something that I do see a lot is, people will go into training, into racing, going, I'm going to beat this person. That's probably one of the worst things you can do, because you're focusing your energy more on them than you are on yourself. And a quote from a coach that I really admire is, don't worry about the competition. Let the competition worry about you, which basically means focus on what you're doing. Don't waste your energy focusing on other people or what other people are doing, i.e. outcomes, beating them. Because by doing the things that you need to and trying to be the best that you can be and putting all your effort into it, you won't have to worry about that, hopefully. So just moving on a little bit more from that. Put all these up. There we go. So just a couple of key points with this, utilizing this process. People who achieve the maximum that they are capable of, people who get the best out of themselves, they're always in a state of evaluation and continuous development. So using this idea of this 4E's process, they're always envisioning, they're always enacting, they're always evaluating or enhancing their performance and keep going back through that again over and over and over. They set targets, and this is kind of linked to the envision, enact, evaluate, enhance bit. Envision, they set themselves targets. Enacting, they conduct experiments. It's an anytime you enact something, it's an experiment. You got to commit to that experiment, try it. Then after that, part 3, you reflect and evaluate on what you've done. And then part 4, in your hands, you're tweaking it, trying to make it that little better, and then going back, envisioning a new target. So with this new tweaking, what am I going to try and achieve this time? Going and experimenting, conducting a test, doing it over and over again. So hopefully that makes some sense. People who achieve the maximum that are capable of, they understand that time is an asset. We've got so much time. And the big question is how much time do you actually waste? And we could use a simple example. Sorry, I just keep looking to see where the dog is. There's a simple example, and one that I think may be a common theme that everyone can relate to and that's post-ball. When you could get out and have the opportunity to do some stretching work or some mobility work that can help you prepare for the next session and to help enhance flexibility. How much time do you actually spend doing that? It's a small thing, and to be honest, it's not the most entertaining or interesting of things, but doing that every day will actually compound itself. And that improvement you make over a number of months just by doing that little bit of work on it will make a huge difference. And just that little investment of extra time that you may sit there and go, oh, no, well, I do that. But then when you really assess it and sit down and be honest about it, do you use that time well? Is that well done? Or is it just kind of doing it to make it look like it's being well done, if that makes sense? So time is used as an asset. It's not working against us. It's there for us to take advantage of. We have the time. You just got to use it the best way possible. The third point there, I think it's important when it comes to, setting processes for yourself. And again, kind of tapping into some of the discussion that we've had about mental preparation and things like that. Having a set direction and then consistently tweaking that and going through the cycle process of working on it and working on it and working on it and going in that direction until there's a logical point where actually you can look at it and go, you know what, that doesn't work for me. I think I need to look at something slightly different. Or you get to the point where, oh no, this is perfect. This is actually exactly what I need. And this tweaking that I've done over a period of time, weeks, months, years, is actually really paid off. So the big message here is what's important when you're setting yourself a process. And again, using this idea of mental preparation is not to go into it and have like 4 different ways that you're going to go and do it. So some of the examples are, you go to a competition. Well, if this person's here, then I'm not going to listen to music because of this, this, and this. But if this happens, I am going to listen to music. That's very mixed up. It's not particularly consistent, and it's going to make you feel anxious because you're not really going to know what to expect. You've got all of these things that you could do, but trying to put your finger on the right one is going to be difficult. And then evaluating that's very difficult. So I think it's important to have a direction that you go in. Pick something, commit to it. Experiment with it, evaluate it, tweak it. Go through that process. Go through it. Go through it. It might be over an entire race weekend. It might be over multiple training sessions, multiple training weeks. It might be over 3 or 4 meets that you might do something, but you've got to build on it before you then go, is this for me? Is it not for me? Does that make sense? And that kind of links into the final point there, is not throwing away ideas if they don't work right away. And that's one of the biggest things that I can hear. How did that go? Well, it didn't work. Well, explain to me why it didn't work. What's the evidence behind that? Well, I don't already know. And that's kind of tends to be the theme with these things. It's very throwaway, but you've got to think about it as a process of building, and you've got to give it time. I said time is a resource and an asset. It is, and that's how well we use it. But also, in order to be able to develop a skill or to understand to let things sink into what works best for you, you've got to be patient. I think if there's one word that I think we can all learn a little bit more from, it's that word patience. That it takes a lot of time to be able to get anywhere with anything. And it takes a lot of thought and a lot of evaluating and a lot of reflection to be able to really hone in on how to do things in the best way possible for us. So hopefully that makes some sense. So moving forward a little bit, like looking at practicing pre-competition strategies in training. So this is going to be filled with quite a few examples of some different ideas about all of the different opportunities you will have within a training session. And then we can link those to they're all directly linked to then what you will do in a competition. And actually there's a basic structure I use within this that you can probably see that a session pretty much looks like a competition, if that makes some sense. And hopefully it will in a second. So I think one of the big messages here is training is your testing ground. You can use a process and evaluate it with your coach on your own during a training session. You've got so many opportunities to test and tweak ideas during a given training set. Obviously with the right guidance. You don't want to go and do things randomly on your own, because if you don't know what you're doing, then you're kind of testing for no reason. But when it comes to strategies like how to warm up properly, or how to mentally prepare, or what technique to use, for example, you've got so many opportunities within a training session to test ideas and thoughts. And maybe it could be a hand entry. Well, I want to get in like this, so maybe I try bringing it slightly this way, or maybe that doesn't quite feel the way it needs to be, or my coach is telling me it's not quite there. Maybe I'll try it a little bit more here or a little bit more there. Those little tweaks and changes, that's your testing ground. That training environment is your testing ground. The racing environment isn't your testing ground for a lot of things, and I'll go into that. It's your way of putting things to the test and working on it and actually putting it into practice, proper practice. But it isn't your tweaking ground where you go in there and just suddenly go, oh, well, I'm just going to do this today, if that makes sense. So where are the opportunities in any session to practice preparation? Now here on the right hand side, so this is just a handful of ideas, okay, of things that we can practice that directly relate to the racing environment. So fundamentally, at the end of any block of training, the competition, the target competition, that is what we are preparing for. Training is not just arbitrary, turn up and we're just going to work you hard. We are always moving towards that. What is that target competition? What is that goal for this next 15 weeks? What is that goal for this season? What is that goal for 4 years' time? Everything has got its place and we're always progressing towards it, okay? So if we look at a pre-session perspective, things that we can always practice at training, arriving on time. Now, I want to make it clear that arriving on time, and this is easy for me to say as a coach because it can sound like this is just purely a demand, but this is my justification for being on time and being punctual. Being on time is a direct reflection of how mentally prepared you are to complete your training session and to prepare for your competition. If you're late, your mind is elsewhere. You're coming in late, you're rushing, you've got to catch up on things. You're not able to go through things in the best and most organized way. So arriving on time is a direct reflection of how prepared you are, a direct reflection. Managing distractions, a competition, there are so many distractions. You're seeing friends that you haven't seen for a while. They come over, they start talking to you while you're doing pre-pull, for example, or when you're in the warm-up. What do? You start talking to them. What you're doing is compromising your performance and your preparation strategy to have a conversation. Is that the right place for it? It's debatable. Pre-pull, we do the same pre-pull in all of our swim sessions as we pretty much do at all the competitions. And there's a reason for that it is there to help you prepare, and that it becomes like clockwork. It gives you what you need to be able to physically get yourself in the right positions, to be able to get in the water and warm up effectively. But it's the same, so then you can be prepared to get to the racing situation, and there is no doubt about what you are doing, and that is stuff that you know and understand. It's not new things that have been thrown at you. A mental readiness, getting yourself mentally prepared and psyched up to be able to hit that water and to start being ready to get the most out of yourself as soon as you touch the pool. It's an interesting question to see who is ready when they hit that water, who is mentally ready for the tasks ahead, for the intensity of the session that is about to happen, and to really maximize it. Warm up, preparing your technique. Are you using the same technique as you've been practicing? Are you getting that all prepared and moving in the right way? Again, mental preparation in the warm up, it's a huge part of it. Being patient, thinking through what you're doing, almost envisioning and imagining what it's going to be like when you hit that race and how that warm-up benefits it. Physical preparation, like being physically warmed up. The main set in a training session, generally now this mainly at the moment applies to the older athletes in the team, but there is always a slight little bit of time between the warm-up finishing and the main set starting. Now, for some groups, for some of the younger groups, that could be a minute or two, very short. The older groups, depending on what type of session is, it could be a bit longer because they just need that little bit of time to be able to get ready and to get the job done with the intensity that we're looking for. But are you doing forms of your race preparation, whether it's mental preparation, physical preparation in terms of exercise? If there's a dive within that set, are you stepping onto the block at the same side that you would normally get on when you race? Are you going through the same little habits? As an example, I used to crack my toes on the edge of the block every race, and I did that every training session. It was part of my process. Are you going through that full preparation? And that also links into the second point there of behind the block routine. Again, I'll use my preparation as an example. I used to do 3 counter movement jumps, so dropping down and jumping as high as I could, straight back and forth, 3 in a row, every single time I raced, and every single time I did a dive in training. I'd always do it. And that was part of my preparation process. So it became so inbuilt and ingrained in routine that it couldn't really go wrong. And during the main set, and this kind of links in heavily to managing a race weekend, is, are you managing your expectations and emotions through a training set? Now, easy example here of managing expectations and emotions is you could go into a set, you could feel amazing. I'm going to have the best set of my life or the best session of my life. Get in the middle of it, not going so well. How are you managing that? Are you starting to get frustrated? Are you starting to throw things around? Are you starting to just go, oh, well, I'm not going to bother now? Or are you managing that and going, well, actually, this is not quite where I want it to be, but I'm going to get the most out of it. I'm going to focus on the main thing I can do here is give my best effort. That is all I can do. All you can ever do, ladies and gentlemen, is give your best effort to everything you do. Anything less than that, you need to question, but you can't do more. You can only give your best, but only you can really know what your best is, because you can lie to other people, or you can try and show to other people that, I am doing X, Y, and Z, but you can't lie to yourself. It is one of those things that is part of growing up and building through the sport. And then moving on to cool down, taking emotions out of the situation. Now, this is a really important one. And this is something that doing this within training sessions, and the easy example here is if you haven't had a training session that you see as being as good as it could have been better. Maybe you felt a bit fatigued, or maybe something happened. It could have been way better. When you evaluate that, and this is something I hear an awful lot when I ask, how was that session? Oh, it was terrible. And that's just too extreme. There's no terrible training session. Every training session has a learning opportunity that you can take away from it. So the problem with going, this is terrible, that was terrible, is it's too emotional. You're just letting negative emotions drain over you. And the reason I put it in the cool down here, this idea of taking the emotion out of it, is the cool down is your cool down mental period as well as your physical period. You can go through that and you can just let your brain stop for a second, settle it down and go, right, what happened? How did that go? And give a proper assessment of the situation, taking the emotions away from it. I mean, there may be some situations where people in the team might have seen this before with me, that if people have come up post race, for example, and they've been frustrated with a race and they're not willing to give a proper evaluation, the first thing I say, look, go and cool down, go and swim down, take your time, come back, and then we'll talk afterwards. Reason for that is it lets the emotion drain. You're taking that away so you can properly look at it. If that makes sense. You know, cooling down, you can reflect and evaluate on what you've done. And then the final bit of that cool down bit is being prepared for the next opportunity. You know, and it's such a big thing. Being prepared for the next opportunity is a massive part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. Is that as soon as that session is finished, your mind is right. Okay, nutritionally, from a hydration perspective, from a stretching perspective, mental situation, you know, what do I need to do to be ready for that next training session? So I'm come in with the same energy and the same positive, let's get something out of this, and vigor that you had before. So there's always a big question is, you know, why is it important to have a process and to rehearse it? So it makes it a habit. So when you turn up on race day, it's not stressful. It doesn't cause you anxiety. Things that you want to do on race day, you are layering it, like I'm talking about here on the right-hand side. You're layering that with a training session. Now, observant swimmers may notice that if you break this down into its simplest components, you've got a pre-session bit, so that's your pre-pool and arrival and all that stuff. You've got your warm-up, your main set, and your cool down. Now, that may be a simple training session structure, but what does it also look like? It looks like a race structure. You do your pre-race, you do your warm-up, you do your race cool down, and then repeat the cycle. It's all there. It's a structure, it's a process, and it's there to help you develop the readiness and the skills needed to be able to deal with things when the time comes, when you're at that target competition. So evaluating your process through great reflection is a massive key skill. And this is not just a skill for swimming, guys. This is a skill for life. You know, if you learn how to do this, you will constantly be able to really focus in on what will make me better and how can I keep improving that. You know, so learning how to critically look at what you do is a vital skill in life. You know, critically look at it. And by critical, I don't mean criticism. I don't mind saying, you're telling yourself that, oh, that was awful, Chris, that was this, that was that. That's what being critical is. That's giving yourself criticism. What being critical is having a really honest look at what you did. What did I do well? What didn't I do well? How do I move forward with those two things? How do I keep making those strengths stronger? And how do I keep making those things that need to be better that little better and try and bring them closer to my strengths as much as possible? That is being critical of what you do, not giving yourself criticism, which is two different things for me. Okay? All right. So anyone who's super observant may have noticed that I've changed my location in this video all of a sudden, and I think I've changed clothes too. I hope I've changed clothes. I had a bit of a technical difficulty, so this is kind of the second part of the recording. So you have got this workshop a bit late. This is the reason why. So just moving forward to the end of this workshop presentation. So looking on this slide now at practicing pre-competition strategy and thinking about the race day. So some of the components of the race day side of this is it's important to arrive at race day understanding exactly how you're going to approach your preparations. Now, of course, there are always going to be things that happen out of your control and things we weren't necessarily expecting that we need to adapt to. Having that adaptability, it's an important skill and something that you do need to learn because things change very rapidly at times. You know, that could be your car could break down, for example. You know, you might not be in the heat that you're expecting to be in. It could be earlier, it could be later. There are all sorts of things that happen. So you just need to be prepared for that. But generally, what we want to try and do is go into our race days or race weekends and know pretty much, without much of a shadow of doubt, how we're going to approach it. Now, for some of the age group swimmers, this may be a little bit more flexible than for swimmers who are more youth and senior level, who have had a bit more experience with it all. You know, some of that might be down to warm-ups. You know, maybe little tweaks of the warm-up here and there. They may just need a little bit more coach input into that. But as you get older, obviously, you will generally become, and the target here is to become more autonomous in what you do. So with that being said, obviously we want to come in prepared and understanding what we're going to do. So the key points here are, we don't want to leave things to chance. Leaving things to chance increases stress and anxiety levels, something that we don't really need when we want to go in and perform at our best, especially when we think about it from a getting in the zone perspective. If we are overly stressed and anxious, we may put ourselves either too far over to one side. If we need that little bit of stress and anxiety, that is a good thing for us as individuals, maybe, if that's what we need. But if we're too far over the edge, we're going to fall off the cliff and we're not going to be able to do anything. We're going to be overly stressed, and that's not what we want. But also, even more so for the guys who are more in the middle or to the side of needing minimal amount of stress, you don't need that. So being prepared and being understanding of what you need to do is very important. Second point there, see, if you have a plan, you can then actually evaluate and tweak that plan as you move forward, and you can go back to using that 4E's principle of continuous development. Knowing what you've done and that you've done it numerous times in the same way, and not added in randomized elements or gone, well, I've got 4 different strategies that I use before races. Well, 4 is very hard to pin down what is actually going well. If you're trying 4 different things at the same time, how are you really going to know what is working or what's not working? So I think having a specific way and focusing on one particular part, which is the next section here, and the keynotes, committing yourself to one process is important. And that one process, while it may not be perfect, it may be something that you can take things from because you do it numerous times and go, well, that works, but this element of it doesn't. And this is where the tweaking starts to come in, that you can tweak that and go, well, let's take the things that work, let's experiment with a new element, let's bring those together. Again, what works there and what can we discard? And what suddenly you start building up this really big understanding, a really big toolbox of things that work for you on a race day. And kind of that links into completing the process every time you compete, and being mindful of the target of the actual competition is important. And we've already said that making new changes that you've never done before at major target meets that you want to swim your best at, things that end up being at the end of training cycles or at the end of a season, those aren't the opportunities and the time for making wholesale changes to what you do. That is where you want to put the things that you practice consistently in the training environment and in the racing environment throughout the season into practice at their absolute best. Now, they may not be exactly right, the thing that you absolutely need, which takes a long time to understand what that is, but you're committing yourself to a process and you're creating a better preparation situation for yourself. It's not always about being perfect, although we always want to work to being as close as we possibly can to that. And the final point here, and this is kind of part of post-race evaluation, and this kind of comes in it from an observational perspective, something that I see every so often, is it's important to learn how to remove emotions as much as you possibly can from your evaluation process. And within this context, I'm coming from this context here as when you talk post-race to me as your coach, very often it can be the case that swimmers can come back. They haven't quite got the overall performance time that they want. And first question was, so tell me about that swim. What was your reflections of it? Oh, it was terrible. Well, it's not a really good way to go about it. Too much emotion involved in that. You can't delve down to the facts of what actually happened, what went well, what didn't go well. How do we then compound and get better at those strengths? And how do we take those weaknesses back to the training environment and make them a little bit better, and make them not so stressful? Those are the kind of things that we want to be delving down into when we evaluate our performances or our process or our races. So taking the emotion out of that is a skill in itself, and it takes time. You won't always be able to do it, but it's something that is important. And a little note I made at the end there is, if this has ever happened to you where you feel like your emotions have bubbled over, have you had a strategy? I think I may have already mentioned in this video, and I'm saying it like that because this is actually the next day I'm recording this particular part, that things that I've done before just to assist athletes in this is, if it's clear their emotions are maybe getting a bit too much, go to the swim down pool, go and cool down, go and complete your process in terms of your cool down and giving yourself a little bit of mental space. Come back and then we'll talk about it. Gives them some space, gives you some time to actually focus on it. So that's most of the the work side of all of this. Now, leading into kind of the task for the week, and just a little bit of a recommendation here. So I just want to recommend a little bit of reading if anyone's interested. And I want to recommend this book called Atomic Habits by James Clear. Now, this book is absolutely in my my top 5, absolutely, of all time books. And reason for that is it gives a really clear explanation of how to look at building habits and the importance of your habits and how it can have a huge impact on what you do. You know, habits is something that you may mention to people and go, oh, well, it's only small little things. What's the purpose of that? But the big message that he creates in the first bullet point here on the slide is he discusses in quite a lot of depth why building small little habits every day make huge difference in the long term. And it's a really great read. And what I'm actually going to do as the task for this week is just send out, along with this video, a copy of the first chapter of the book, which I downloaded off his website because I subscribed to his email list. So I was able to get that. And just for you to read and kind of get a little bit of an insight as to what the book's about. So I think it's about 12 pages or so. It probably take you about 20 minutes, 25 minutes maybe to read it. Gives you a really good idea. And if you're interested, then you can go on. You can maybe check out the book. But if you're not so interested, then it gives you just a little bit of a basic understanding as to how to build habits and why they're important. So just a couple of final points on the book. It shows what our progress can really look like, and how we approach this to maximize how we improve. There's a great little graph in the intro that talks about improvement and how that looks different for different people. Really interesting insight. It looks at focusing on building better systems over just focusing on goals. Now, goals are important and you need to have that to strive for, but the system idea is what is the structure in the system you put in place in order to get to that goal. And one of the best examples he actually makes is people who win and people who lose have the same goal. So how do you differentiate why the person won and why the person didn't win? How do you differentiate that? Because they both have the same goal. It's the system. It's how they approach that and the habits that they have that allow them to get the most out of themselves. It's a really interesting perspective. The final point there as well, he goes quite in depth into how to develop a system or how to develop an understanding of systems of building habits. And he does it in a really, really good way. He uses some really good storytelling to help do that. And gives a really nice, clean framework to do it as well. And he really kind of delves into the psychology of how to build relevant change for yourself. And if anyone wants to find out a little bit more about Atomic Habits, I like to say, I subscribe to James Clear's email list every single week. I've actually got his habit diary as well, which is very helpful. So if anyone wants any more information, just let me know about that. So hopefully you've enjoyed this workshop. Again, the task is just simply to read the first chapter of Atomic Habits. And it'd be great to know what everyone thinks on Coach Now. So please post your thoughts on the chapter or your thoughts on the workshop in the Coach Now. And I look forward to hearing from everybody. Stay safe, guys.